Thank you guys for making it to this last panel of the day. It's felt like a very long day, but also productive day. And one thing that I am actually quite grateful for, it kind of happened by accident, was our decision to put this panel today with the panel that we had in the morning, because actually I think there's a lot thematically that might carry over from the conversation that we had prior to Boris Grace's talk. And also, I guess, quite frankly, what Boris Grace himself said. So without further ado, the title of today's panel is, if I can find it, is Marx, History and the East. And it is my great pleasure to introduce as our first speaker, Igor Shoikhedbrod. So Igor Shoikhedbrod is an assistant professor with a joint appointment in political science and law, justice and society at Dalhousie University. Igor obtained his PhD at the University of Toronto in 2018, his master's in political science from York University in 2011, and he also has a BA from University of Toronto with a concentration in ethics, society, and law. His dissertation was awarded the Stephen E. Bronner Dissertation Award in 2019, quote, for an outstanding political science dissertation, finished within the previous year of the APSA meeting, which exemplifies the commitment to use scholarship in the struggle for a better world. Prior to his recent appointment at Dalhousie, Igor taught courses in political theory, legal theory, ethics, and political economy at the University of Toronto, where he received 2 awards for teaching excellence. He's the author of Revisiting Marxist Critique of Liberalism, Rethinking Justice, Legality, and Rights with Palgrave Macmillan, as well as several scholarly articles in contemporary political theory, Journal of Social Philosophy, Political Studies Review, Critical Horizons, Canadian Journal of Law and Jurisprudence, Critical Analysis of Law, the Hegel Bulletin, the Owl of Minerva, and Marx and Philosophy Review of Books. He's also written additional articles and reviews that are forthcoming in History of Political Thought and New Political Science. So without further ado, I present Igor Shoikhedbrod.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction. I'm just going to make sure that I have everything in order, the notes here, and then start my timer to be cognizant of time. So I want to start with Alan Bloom, actually, and to argue that there is indeed a rational kernel to Bloom's seemingly mystical claim that Kojève was a profound Marxist who turned to Hegel after being dissatisfied with the supposed thinness of Marx's account of the human. If Marx's account of the human was as thin as Bloom would have us believe, why did he, Bloom, regard Kojève as a Marxist in the first and final instance? The esoteric teaching that I wish to draw from Bloom's observation is that Kojève was foremost an original thinker who cannot accurately be pigeonholed as a quote-unquote Marxist, even while he was deeply influenced by Marx, as by Hegel, Heidegger, and Solovyov, and indeed contributed to his self-image as a Marxist. The main shortcoming of interpreting Kojève as a Marxist, as we'll see, I hope, is that it results in a double disservice to Kojève and to Marx. My aim, therefore, is to probe beneath their elusive affinities so as to unearth their important divergences. Let's start with labor objectification, alienation, and emancipation. Kojève helped popularize the view that Marx's treatment of alienated labor and his account of class struggle were rooted in Hegel's master-slave dialectic. Now, as far as careful textual studies go, Chris Arthur remains one of the first scholars in the Hegelian Marxist tradition to have questioned the veracity of this Kojèvian-inspired view, and with some measure of success. When one turns to Marx's unpublished 1844 comments on James Mill, where references to mastery, servitude, and recognition are omnipresent, it is apparent that Marx had in mind a system of production and exchange that is defined by the generalized subservience or servitude of human beings to the power of commodities, as well as the relations of mutual distrust and trickery between commodity owners in the market. At no point does Marx invoke Hegel's account of the master-lowered, bondsman-slave dialectic to make any of his substantive points. The same, by the way, is true for Marx's economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, even more famous for the penetrating treatment of alienated labor as being bound up with the commodification of labor power, a term that Marx will use in Capital, as well as the separation of workers, as we know, from the products of their labor, the productive process, their species being, and one another. When Hegel's name is invoked in these manuscripts by Marx, he is given credit by Marx for recognizing that transformative side of labor, but is then taken to task almost immediately for only focusing on the positive side of labor and intellectual labor in general. So this is a sort of a double-handed compliment by Marx. It is only in the Grundrisse that Marx clearly invokes Hegel's master-slave dialectic as an analog to the relation between wage labor and capitals. Marx observes, and here I quote, the recognition, and the German word is Erkennen, of the products as its own, and this judgment that its separation from the conditions of its realization is improper, forcibly imposed, is an enormous advance or awareness, Bewusstsein, itself the product of the mode of production resting on capital, and as much the nail to the doom as with the slave's awareness that he cannot be the property of another. With his consciousness of himself as a person, the existence of slavery becomes a merely artificial, vegetative existence and ceases to be able to prevail as the basis of production, end quote. At first sight, Marx's parallel between the situation of the worker and that of the slave appears to vindicate Kojève's interpretation of the parallel. However, on closer inspection or reading, it is evident that Marx is referring to a cognitive awareness on the part of the worker that is indispensable to their emancipation or becomes indispensable to their emancipation. While this insight certainly resonates with Hegel's account of the slave's experience, a negative moment, it does not match the disproportionate emphasis that Kojève places on the modality or dialectic of desire and the accompanying struggle for recognition in his, I'd argue, idiosyncratic and original reading of Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. And here I agree actually with Boris Groys that the emphasis on the modality of desire is really, accentuated in Kojève in ways that it's not, as I'll argue, in Marx and even in Hegel. Returning to Marx's passing remarks, it is not that the capitalist seeks the worker's recognition as analogous to the master, nor is it the case that that the worker is seeking the capitalist's recognition. We could argue about that later. Kojève knew far too well that the master-slave dialectic was but one, albeit rudimentary, moment in the phenomenological odyssey, among many others, of course. Yet in his hands, and this is a testament to Kojève's originality and creativity, the modality of desire was transformed into an ontological starting point for human culture and civilization, while the enduring legacy of the struggle between master and slave would precipitate the end of history, quote unquote, in the universal homogeneous state. Contrary to prevailing belief, one that has been popularized by Francis Fukuyama, among others, this was Kojève's original discovery, which was not planted in his mind by Marx, or for that matter, I would argue, by Hegel. To grasp the distinctiveness of Kojève's contribution, it helps to revisit three revealing passages from the introduction to the reading of Hegel that merit closer scrutiny. The first one, I quote, "Without this fight to the death for pure prestige, there would never have been human beings on earth. Indeed, the human being is formed only in terms of a desire directed toward another desire. That is, finally, in terms of a desire for recognition. Therefore, the human being can be formed only if at least two of these desires confront one another." Quote number two, "History is the history of the working slave. To see this, one need only consider the relationship between master and slave. That is, the first result of the, quote, first human social historical contract, no longer from the master's point of view, but from the slaves." And final quote from Kojève here, "Therefore, it is by work and only by work that man realizes himself objectively as man. Only after producing an artificial object is man himself really and objectively more than and different from a natural being." Now, while the Marx of the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844 would grant that human beings are sensuous and finite beings, his starting point is that of circumscribed needs, rather than a primordial desire for pure prestige that then gives way to a broader struggle for recognition, second order. Marx writes, this is the economic and philosophic manuscript, "Man as an objective sensuous being is therefore a suffering being, and because he feels his suffering, he is a passionate being. Passion is man's essential power vigorously striving to attain its object. It is true, as Kojève suggests in the second passage, that history for Marx and Engels can be viewed as a successive history of the working slave, provided that such a history tracks the extent to which human beings become conscious of their circumstances and emancipate themselves from the alien forces that previously held power or dominion over them. However, it does not follow from Marx or Engels that the relationship between master and slave is in any way the first human social historical contract. This would be a profoundly ahistorical outlook, according to Marx and Engels and their materialist conception of history. After all, the interchange between human beings and nature through labor has historically given rise to different forms of social intercourse, different modes of production, including but not limited to the so-called ancient mode of production, which had slavery as its defining characteristic. This brings me to the third quoted passage by Kojève earlier, which reveals important affinities between him and Marx. In the 1844 manuscripts, as well as in Capital, Marx acknowledges that conscious life activity distinguishes human beings from non-human animals, including some of the most sophisticated non-human animals. The most harmful aspect of alienated labor is that it reduces the conscious life activity of human beings to mere animal life activity or animal life functions, the most obvious ones being physical survival and reproduction. Needless to say, Hegel remains a decisive bridge between Marx and Kojève in this third passage that was quoted. Specifically, in Hegel's account of the unique human capacity relative to non-human animals to contemplate ourselves in a world of our own making, that is, by becoming conscious of our history. The difference between Marx and Kojève in this respect is that while Kojève is willing to affirm the history of the working slave to a point, Marx sees labor as potentially becoming life's prime want, critique of the Gotha program, under transformed circumstances, whereas Kojève speaks of happiness and the cessation of action at the end of history. Now, this brings me to the end of history and the universal homogeneous state / the socialist empire. Our short contrast of Kojève and Marx would be incomplete without a discussion of the projected end of history and the universal homogeneous state. These topics, in my view, are best considered when Kojève's outline of a phenomenology of right is brought together with the notion of authority, which was recently published, translated in English. The outline details a series of what I would call determinate negations or sublations, the movement from aristocratic right, which of course is defined by mastery, through bourgeois right, which is inspired by the slave revolt, which eventually culminates, at least in the outline, in the empire of private socialist international right, or trois, tracking the movement, of course, from rank or status through equivalence and ultimately equity. The reason these two works should be brought together as almost a complete legal political philosophy, a Kojèvian political legal philosophy, is because the idealized precondition for the end of history in the universal homogeneous state for Kojève entails the fullest universalization of justice, or trois, the intervention or judgment of the impartial, disinterested third. In the notion of authority, what's also interesting is that Kojève denotes this form of authority, and there are a few, of course, as Platonic or inspired by Plato, emphasizing its unchanging, some ways transcendent and even divine characteristics, though not literally because he was an atheist. History for Kojève can indeed come to an end in the universal homogeneous state because everyone will finally be recognized and there'll be no more reasons to struggle over prestige. In Kojève's framework, it is critical that the fullest realization of the legal form, quote unquote, trois, is accompanied by the disappearance of the political form, which he understood in terms of Smith's friend-enemy distinction. We saw this as well in Teresa's presentation. While the end of history thesis, is routinely attributed to Marx's supposedly post-political vision of communist society, the matter, once again, I'd like to argue, is more complicated when we read Marx's writing with care. When Marx addresses this issue, perhaps the only time he really directly addresses this issue of the end of history, in his 1859 preface, here's what he writes. He writes, I quote, "The bourgeois mode of production is the last antagonistic form of the social process of production." Antagonistic, and this is important, is almost missed out, not in the sense of individual antagonisms or conflicts, but of an antagonism that emanates from the individual social conditions of existence. But the productive forces developing within bourgeois society also create the material conditions for a solution of this antagonism. The prehistory of human society accordingly closes with this social formation. Prehistory of human society closes with this social formation. The end of history for Marx is the beginning of conscious human history. There is no cessation of action and dialectics in the manner of Kojève's universal homogeneous state. This brings me finally to the question of bourgeois right and its overcoming or sublation under full communism. In the critique of the Gotha program, Marx writes, I quote, right can never be higher than the economic structure of society and its cultural development conditioned thereby. In Kojève's outline, the transformation of bourgeois right into private socialist international right parallels the transformation or sublation of equivalence into equity. The latter, equity, is supposed to be more attentive to concrete human differences and needs. Although this dimension of Kojève's thinking was not fully developed, I'd argue, it stands in conflict with the underlying premises of the universal homogeneous state. Homogenization remains a defining feature of bourgeois right and equivalence, particularly abstract labor. For Marx, right, this particular Gotha program, by its very nature can consist only in the application of an equal standard. But unequal individuals, and they would not be different individuals if they were not unequal, are measurable only by an equal standard insofar as they are brought under an equal point of view, are taken from one definite side only. For instance, in the present case, are regarded only as workers and nothing more is seen in them, everything else being ignored, end quote. Could it be that Kojève's private socialist international right was still, to use Marx's language, stigmatized by a bourgeois limitation? To ask these and other questions about Kojève and his relation to Marx is to acknowledge in the final instance that Kojève was above all Kojève, or better yet, a Kojèvian. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Igor. And as a final reminder, we'll have questions after all of the presentations. So hold your questions for Igor if you have them. So next up, we have Cristiano Vidali. He's a PhD student in Kojève between the University of Cagliari in Italy and the University of Rouen, Normandie in France. He earned his bachelor's degree in philosophy from the University of Milan, defending a dissertation on Jean-Paul Sartre's Ontology of Freedom under the supervision of Professor Andrea Joc. He then obtained his master's degree in philosophy of the contemporary world from Vita Salute San Raffaele, University of Milan, where he worked under the supervision of Professor Massimo Cacciari on Alexandre Kojève's philosophy of history. He's the winner of the Mimesis Prize 2019 in the youth section for philosophy, and he now cooperates with the chair in moral philosophy and philosophical anthropology at the University of Milan. He is also a subject expert, cultore della materia, on phenomenology and phenomenology of experience, also at the Vita Salute San Raffaele, University of Milan, where he works with Professor Vincenzo Costa. His main research interests include Husserl's phenomenology, with a particular reference to the issue of attention, existential phenomenology, and philosophy of history. And today his title is, for his presentation, is Kojève as a Sociologist, History and Acceleration. So, Cristiano.
Thank you, Trevor, very much for your kind introduction, and many thanks to all the organizers for involving me in this workshop and for giving me the opportunity to share some reflections on Kojève, who is a very important piece of my philosophical path, just like for any of us, I guess. So the central subject of my today's speech is a theme that Kojève mentioned only sporadically, actually a couple of times, which has been widely underrated in accounting for his philosophical framework. I'm talking about the theme of acceleration. The first occasion where Kojève spoke of this subject is in the first book of Essai d'une histoire raisonnée de la philosophie païenne, during a quarrel with the specific form of skepticism represented by sociologism. The skepticism of sociologism, says Kojève, consists in the reduction of human reality to empirical facts and therefore to special entities. In this way, of course, temporality and historical knowledge, which is necessarily mediated by time, directly disappear from any argumentation, and in a classic relativism, limiting itself to attesting to a plurality of knowledge related to the fact that men are born in different geographical areas and inherit specific cultures, so that no philosophy that compares such knowledge, let alone wisdom, is possible. Simply, human discourses would be in their nature not commensurable with each other. It is interesting to notice that Kojève does not respond to this typically skeptical position, which in his opinion is incompatible with wisdom, with a theoretical objection, but rather with a factual one, that is, an objection on the same level of skepticism. In particular, he points out how more and more cultural traditions, different from each other in longevity, history, geographical position, and institutional order, since after the French Revolution and naturally since 1807, tend de facto to progressively converge, becoming more and more similar. So in Kojève's own word, here I quote directly from the French version of Essai d'une histoire raisonnée de la philosophie païenne, aucune personne de bonne foi ne voudrait contester que les diversités en question s'amenuisent de jour en jour, tant de pays à pays que de classe sociale à classe sociale. Et du train dont vont de nos jours les choses, ce n'est certainement pas heurter le bon sens que de dire que les jours où il n'y aura plus de telle diversité du tout ne sont plus très lointains. Rien n'empêcherait donc, du point de vue sociologique, je remarque, qu'il n'y ait plus un jour qu'une seule et unique philosophie. So here, faced with a skeptical assumption that acknowledges the fact of cultural diversity, Kojève contrasts the fact of cultural homologation in the literal sense of homos and logos, the same knowledge, something which maybe today we would improperly call globalization. However, what in my opinion is extremely interesting about this passage is what follows, namely an observation by Kojève on the way in which this homologation is achieved. Again, I quote from the same text. Sans doute pourrait-on dire avec assez de bon sens qu'en s'accélérant d'une façon vraiment extraordinaire, le mouvement historique avance de moins en moins, ce qui permettrait d'affirmer qu'il s'agit d'une fonction asymptotique ascendante qui est déjà infiniment proche de la droite verticale fixant la limite de son déplacement horizontal dans le sens du progrès des valeurs positives de sa variable indépendante. So actually, the absolutely new element introduced here by Kojève is precisely that of acceleration. The same topic is also mentioned by the author in the famous interview with Gilles Lapouge in 1968, where Kojève asks the interviewer, la fameuse accélération de l'histoire dont on parle tant, avez-vous remarqué qu'en s'accélérant de plus en plus, le mouvement historique avance de moins en moins? So have you noticed that by accelerating more and more, the historical movement advances less and less? Now, the question of acceleration is a typically sociological issue, generally understood as a transversal process because it concerns lifestyles, technology, institutions, cultural aspects, and which had already largely emerged in the last century, especially in the second half, hence the deliberately provocative title that I gave to my talk, that is Kojève as a sociologist, with a question mark. But as is evident, Kojève's use of the theme of acceleration is anything but sociological. On the contrary, he makes it an exquisitely theoretical and philosophical problem, noting that the more history accelerates, the less it advances. To paraphrase, the more events are produced in terms of quantity and rapidity, and much less they involve an essential qualitative transformation in the specific sense of historical transformation. Paradoxically, the more things change, the more they resemble each other. So it is evident that Kojève is speaking here of the fundamental and famous theme of the end of history. The vertical line that sets the limit of the advancement of history refers precisely to the well-known realization of the universal and homogeneous state, where events occur, but only in the sense of happenings, where post-historical men certainly continue to live and eat, but they no longer transform anything. There is no more transforming work, labor, there are no negativity capable of introducing novelty. However, what in my opinion is extremely interesting is that here the end of history does not happen in a neutral way, but comes right after this speeded movement. It follows acceleration. Now, anyone who knows Kojève and the importance of the subject of the end of history for his thought cannot avoid noting the singularity of the theme of acceleration and the specificity of the position in which it is located, that is, for how inappropriate this expression may be, right before the end of history. And if Kojève chose to place acceleration in this way, it is evident that it must have a connection with the end of history. It must somehow prepare it in some way. At most, and this is the idea that I would like to argue here and that I tried to develop in my book on Kojève published last year, acceleration determines the end of history. In short, history ends because of acceleration. Now, if history ends because of acceleration, this does not just tell us something about the end of history, but also about that history that ended. More precisely, this suggests that there is something that, while history was, so to say, was still alive, silently persisted and counted as a precondition for the existence of history itself. It tells us that history had a time without or with less acceleration, and perhaps that history needed a non-accelerated time in order to reproduce itself, so that specifically historical human subjectivities could mature, and so that their actions, their work, their revolutions could be historical as well. In my opinion, the term that sums up all of these preconditions, as again I have argued in my book, is tradition. Once again, we are dealing with an infrequent subject in Kojève's work, mainly mentioned in the notion of authority and in the dialectic of the real and the phenomenological method in Hegel, included in the introduction to the reading of Hegel. And to strongly summarize Kojève's acceptation of this word and to only focus on one aspect of this issue, I would say that tradition, in his view, is that what most provides history with concreteness, preventing historical negation from being merely abstract. And this is true in a double sense. The first one consists in the fact that human actions are authentically historical only if they negate something handed down, inherited as historical, and therefore understood as belonging to one's own historical identity. If a primitive or a man from the other side of the planet who knew nothing of European history had been placed in Berlin of the 9th of November 1989, the act of climbing the Berlin Wall would have been a natural act and not a historical one for him. He would have acknowledged it as the simple act of crossing an obstacle, maybe of breaking it, just as the tangle of brambles that blocks the street or obstructs our path. Indeed, the Berlin Wall would not mean anything to him. On the contrary, an East Berlin militant who breaks the wall and trembles with emotion while doing so performs a historical act, not because of the physical act itself, but because of what the wall objectively represents for him and any other man belonging to Western history or to the European tradition. Hence, it is precisely the fact of inheriting history, made of meanings that of course are interpretable, but only within given objective limits that are themselves inherited from history, that the Colosseum is not a simple pile of rocks, but a Roman monument. That pedestrian crossings are not random stains of paint, but are signals delimiting possible actions and reciprocal expectations, some of them lawful and some other illegal. That entering the Quirinal Palace armed is not an act of vandalism, but an attack on the Italian Republic. Thus, it is only by acting in a transformative, negative sense with regard to meanings and not to merely natural things that historical actions may occur. But one can only historically transform meanings that he has not created. It is in this sense that Kojève speaks of the past as an authority, the authority of all the meanings of the world where I live that have been handed down to me. I quote again from, this time from the notion of authority. The past which exerts an authority over me is a historic past. It is my past, that is to say, the past that is the cause of my present and the basis of my future. It is the past that is held to determine the present with the future in mind. In other words, the past does not acquire an authority except insofar as it presents itself in the guise of a tradition. The second sense in which, according to Kojève, tradition gives substance to history consists in the fact that only what can be turned into a tradition can be historical. An isolated, episodic event, however sensational, is not yet history if considered in itself. In this regard, and here I quote from the introduction to the reading of Hegel, Kojève provides the example of the revolutionary who dreams of a permanent revolution that negates every type of tradition and takes no account of the concrete past except to overcome it, necessarily ends up either in the nothingness of social anarchy or in annulling himself physically or politically. Only the revolutionary who manages to maintain or re-establish the historical tradition by preserving in a positive memory the given present, which he himself has relegated to the past by his negation, succeeds in creating a new historical world capable of existing. As is evident, the second meaning of tradition is possible only in relation to the first. An action can become historical, it can become traditional, if and only if it is carried out within the perimeter of the possibilities and of the meanings inherited from a historical tradition and actualizes them. For this reason, history is such only if it negates a tradition from within, and therefore does not cancel it, but innovates it, thus succeeding in affirming itself as being heritable again. This is why I quote from the introduction to the reading of Hegel: history is always a conscious and willed tradition. There is no history without conscious lived historical memory. And it is by history, which is created, lived, and really remembered as tradition, that man realizes himself or appears as dialectical totality, instead of annihilating himself and disappearing by a pure or abstract negation of every given whatsoever real thought. So if what we have said is correct, the link between the first point, that of acceleration, and the second one, that of tradition, should now clearly appear. If, one, acceleration, so to speak, precedes the end of history, thus legitimizing us to believe that it has consequences on the preconditions for the existence of history itself. If, two, among these conditions of existence is included the presentation of history in the form of an inheritable tradition, starting from which every human subject is born inheriting a world, an asset of meanings that connect him to those who existed before him, to those who generated him and his fellow men. If finally, three, it is only by acting within the framework of this inherited tradition, negating it and innovating it from within, that one can act historically, actually producing heritable actions which can themselves turn into a tradition, then the reason why, in the final analysis, acceleration causes the end of history is precisely that it undermines the possibility of inheriting a common and congeneric world from those who precede us. It strains the chance of inserting into a living tradition and consequently of acting starting from it, of transforming and innovating tradition from within. Thus, history ends because by accelerating, it is no longer possible to inherit history and transform it. One can no longer live or act historically. So, well, this is the thesis that I ultimately have tried to extensively support in my book on Kojève, and that I meant to very briefly suggest today. Of course, I'm aware that it is a rather daring reading, a bit forced, if you like. Nevertheless, I'm quite sure that Kojève's conceptual resources at least allow us to develop this kind of consideration, with which, who knows, maybe he himself would have willingly agreed, witnessing once again how much Kojève's philosophical framework enables us to make again and again new, effective interpretations of the present with which we find ourselves confronted every day. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Cristiano. And I think we have we have an audience welcome to a daring reading of Kojève, possibly the most welcoming audience possible. So last up, we have Danilo Scholz. Danilo Scholz is a historian of ideas who specializes in the history of European political thought in the 19th and 20th century. He's a researcher at the Institute for Advanced Study in the Humanities in Essen, Germany. After earning a BA in history at the University of Cambridge, he relocated to Paris, where he obtained the diploma of the École Normale Supérieure in history and philosophy. His master's thesis, which he completed at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, analyzed the influence of interwar German philosophy on the Russian-born French philosopher Alexandre Kojève. And it won the Raymond Aron Prize, as well as the Marc Bloch Prize, awarded by the European University in Florence. His doctoral dissertation in history, also completed at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, investigated concepts and critiques of the state in French political thought since 1945. Before taking up his position in Essen, Danilo has been a postdoctoral researcher at the European University Institute in Florence and at the Columbia University in New York. He's written on a number of topics, ranging from film and the history of European integration to Habermas's reception of French thought and the political ideas of the young Nietzsche for cultural views such as Merkur, or broadsheets including Die Zeit and Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. In 2019, the German Academy of Arts awarded him the Heinrich Mann Prize for nonfiction essay writing. And the last thing that should be mentioned is that he's currently finishing an intellectual biography on Kojève, which is under contract with the German publisher C.H. Beck. So without further ado, Danilo Scholz, who will be speaking on Kojève and Japan.
Thank you, Trevor, for the kind introduction. I've got a few PowerPoint slides, so I'll put this, turn on the screen sharing. So, do you see that?
Yes,
yeah,
we see.
Works.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. So before I begin, I'd like to thank the organizers for putting together such an exciting program and for inviting me to participate. Since it's already quite late, I suggest we dive right in. I've divided my talk into 4 sections. The first will outline the general thrust of Kojève's famous footnote in The End of History. The second will try to do justice to Kojève, the tourist. The third situates Kojève's appreciation of Japan against the background of more dyspeptic appraisals of the country by contemporaries. And my final section will excavate Kojève's hitherto neglected diplomatic missions to Japan. Just a caveat, during the first minute or so, I'll show a couple of slides, but I've included a lot of visual material for the remaining time. It's the end of a long conference day, so I thought we could all do with some eye candy. But let's start at the beginning. It's probably fair to assume that among those of us working on Alexandre Kojève, the mention of Japan and of its place in Kojève's thought is immediately evocative. This is not because Japan crops up all over Kojève's writings, far from it actually. It only makes a couple of appearances, the most important of which must surely rank among the better known footnotes in the history of ideas. As you all know, the footnote in question can be found in the second edition of Kojève's Introduction à la lecture de Hegel, which appeared in '62, that is 15 years after the original publication date. In this footnote, Kojève affirms that his assessment of the end of history underwent a decisive change following a sojourn in Japan. He dates his epiphany to his stay in Japan in 1959, and he turned conventional assumptions about the centuries-long seclusion of the island country on its head. Because Kojève averred that it was precisely the deliberate decision by its rulers to shut off Japan from external historical influences that made the country a role model for a more enviable post-historical life and the pursuit of brutish material pleasures afforded by the American way of life. With the world disclosing and world transforming potential of war, revolutionary struggle, and work gone, the 2 Cold War antagonists and their satellites henceforth lacked a negativity that spurred humanizing action. As a consequence, they plunged back into animal-like desire, and it holds for both the Soviet Union and the USSR. There's a very peculiar convergence theory at work here. By contrast, Japan upheld forms of negating action for their own sake. The rigid formality of traditional Japanese cultural practices elevate them above boorish gluttony and the breathless hankering for entertainment. Paraphrase the defunct French electro group Daft Punk, Japan preserved ways to remain human after all. How did they do it? Through a radical aestheticization of existence. I would wager that in this brief recapitulation of Kojève's footnote, there was little that was not familiar to most of you. Indeed, it is astonishing to note the canonical status the footnote has acquired over the years. Francis Fukuyama summarizes it at some length in this 1992 book, The End of History and the Last Man. And Fukuyama also integrates Kojève's considerations into his own argument that even when all is said and historically done, human beings need an outlet for their competitive urges, for their desire to affirm their superiority over others and to be recognized by them as superior. The Japanese quest to strive for perfection in apparently superfluous activities would fit this bill. It would satisfy our megalothymia, as Fukuyama, borrowing from Plato, terms this urge. Similarly, Derrida dwells on Kojève's footnote in his 1993 book, Spectres of Marx. His approach comes across as more whimsical than Fukuyama's. Although Derrida is clearly fascinated with what he calls Kojève's neo-Marxist and para-Heideggerian reading of the phenomenology of spirit, he does not conceal how baffled he is by Kojève's penchant for provocation and the profoundly often nutty and metaphysician manner of his reasoning. But no sooner did Derrida pause to express his puzzlement than he moves full steam ahead with his own idiosyncratic dispositions about how precisely to interpret this footnote. Unlike Fukuyama, whom the Japanese way of life represented one form of post-historical existence, Derrida insists that Kojève's injunction to separate form from content retains a utopian promise of a radically different, never fully predetermined or preordained and therefore open future. Yeah, this is a sort of like messianism without messianism. that Derrida kind of tried to develop. Now, the disagreement between Fukuyama and Derrida does not need to detain us here. What I'd like to draw attention to is the fact that both thinkers, despite their diverging ideological outlooks, take Kojève's remarks about Japan as self-evident. And in the remaining time, I want to peel back the layers of that self-evidence. And I was partly inspired to do so in the wake of an experience I had a couple of years ago at a conference on Western intellectuals' obsession with Japan in the 20th century. At this conference in Vienna, there was a palpable gulf between humanities scholars who investigated a particular Western thinker's infatuation with Japan and the Japanese studies scholars who often wondered on what experiential or textual basis these Western thinkers elaborated their grand claims. And I think it's a fair question. Derrida, in the section on Kojève, alludes to this when writing that, I quote, "There's a French tradition, a kind of French specialty of peremptory diagnoses upon returning from a quick trip to a faraway land whose language one does not even speak and about which one knows next to nothing." This does not mean that we should impugn Kojève's hypothesis, quite the opposite, but we might do well to adopt a more naive attitude towards his snappy pronouncements. And by naive, I don't mean clueless, but an unprejudiced willingness to ask why Kojève came to think and write about Japan in the way he did. So for the time being, I'd like to ask you to leave behind the lofty heights of Kojève's philosophy of history and to delve into the mundane practicalities of his relationship to Japan. On at least one level, there's no shame in admitting that Kojève came to Japan as a tourist. Foreign tourists did not flock to Japan in the vast numbers we see today, but the post-war period definitely saw the rise of mass tourism in Japan. For foreigners to visit the country was still something relatively special, though not entirely exceptional. In fact, the first direct flights from Paris to Tokyo were launched in 1961. That option was not open to Kojève when he first visited the country in the fall of 1959. His arrival was much more peripatetic. How do we know this? Well, thanks to Kojève's tendency to meticulously record his travels, when we can reconstruct with some precision his sojourn in Japan. I would even go further and submit that no other trip in Kojève's life has been as amply documented by him as his forays into Japan. Kojève arrived in Tokyo after stopovers in Karachi, Hong Kong, Bangkok. He spent almost all of October and November 1959 in Japan, visiting, to name only a few places, Tokyo, Kyoto, Nara, Kamakura. He marked all of his movements and whereabouts on maps. Even if a famous footnote was the result of a trip in 1959, Kojève returned to Japan twice, once in 1965 and for a vinyl visit in 1967. He kept track of everything. The museums he went to see, he kept track of everything. The museums he went to see, the restaurants he dined at, the amusement quarters where he frolicked, individual pieces of art he admired, hotels he stayed at. Not a single tourist brochure was thrown away, for every item was scrupulously archived by Kojève. In his quest to immerse himself in the country, no guidebook was beneath Kojève's attention. As he explored Japan, Kojève took hundreds of photos, which are available as slides in the French National Library. These photos mostly capture sites, they show monuments, landscapes, or Kojève's hotel rooms. Others are portraits of strangers, of Japanese throwing a pose or appearing in traditional costume. Yet others again show acquaintances of a romantic nature. We should not dismiss such information as an indiscreet intrusion into Kojève's love life in the style of glossy tabloids. The name of a young woman we see here was Keiko Sato, and she furnished Kojève with information about the culture and history of Japan, information he would later draw on when penning his famous footnote. Now that we've gained a better sense of Kojève's itinerary, we are also in a position to answer the question what Kojève read about Japan. Kojève neither spoke nor read Japanese. With a few exceptions, most of the books bought or consulted by him were in English, reflecting both the prevalence of Anglophone scholarship on Japan at the time and the American military presence after World War II. Yet it would be a mistake to assume that Kojève hewed above all to academic monographs. The opposite is the case. A significant chunk of his knowledge about the country derived from the official guides published by the Japanese Tourist Industry Bureau. Kojève's copy of the 6th edition of this guide, which appeared in 1958, is densely annotated from start to finish. No mean feat for a 1,000-page book that covers everything from history to geography, from folklore to culinary taste, from city guides to bus timetables. For Kojève, this official guide was to Japan what the phenomenology of spirit was to Hegel's philosophy. condensed précis of everything you need to know. No single other work on Japan bears as many marks of its excessive use. On almost every page, Kojève underlines and crosses out. As for other printed goods, Kojève mainly stuck to short introductory books on cultural matters, some of which appeared with Tuttle, a well-known English language publisher specializing in all things related to Japan. In Kojève's possession, we find Ellen Gordon Allen's Japanese flower arrangement in a nutshell, a primer that was given to him by his female acquaintance Keiko Sato. He also owned a copy of Yasunosuke Fukukita's Tea Cult of Japan. He pocketed beginner's guides to Noh and Kabuki theater. In addition, several art books in Japan graced his bookshelves. As for French books, he purchased Rika du Japon by Kiku Yamata. Yamata is quite a fascinating figure in her own right, a regular feature of the Paris salon scene in the 20th century. She completed the first French translation of Japan's most famous novel, the Genji Monogatari. In a lavishly illustrated small volume to be found in the Kojève archive, she provides a glimpse into the many facets of ikebana, what flowers to choose, how to trim them, how to combine them, etc. The reason why I'm enumerating these books is to demonstrate that Kojève learned about Japan the way every other non-initiate would, foregoing specialist knowledge in favor of accessible overviews. But if we go back to his footnote, we're left with the question of how he put such a startling spin on such inconspicuous and unassuming source material. Why on earth would Japan, of all places, herald a less depressing end to history? In order to answer that question, we need to place Kojève's hot take in the wider contemporary context of Western views on Japan. One essay in particular cries out for comparison. Arthur Koestler, a Hungarian-born British author who made a name for himself with his 1914 novel Darkness at Noon, there was an unsparing portrayal of Stalin's purges and the Moscow show trials. After the war, he became an anti-communist household name among French literati. Less well known is the fact that he visited Japan at roughly the same time as Kojève. Like Kojève, Koestler turned to the official guide of the Japanese Tourist Industry Bureau for orientation. He related his impressions in a 1960 book called The Lotus and the Robot. Several factors make it likely, though not certain, that Kojève was aware of Koestler's book. For one, as early as 1946, the Kojèvian coterie around the monthly journal Critique was desperately looking for someone to review Koestler's Darkness at Noon. Yet neither Eric Weil nor Georges Bataille succeeded in finding a suitable reviewer. Secondly, Koestler's The Lotus and the Robot was critically acclaimed in France when the French edition came out in 1961, which was about the same time that Kojève put the finishing touches to the second edition of his Introduction à la lecture de Hegel. The reviewer in Le Monde emphasized that for Koestler, visiting Japan proved to be a profoundly disenchanting experience. Juxtaposing Kojève's footnote with Koestler's travelogue reveals that on almost every point of interest, the two men take opposite stances. Let's recall that Kojève singles out the venerable traditions of Noh theater, ikebana flower arrangements, and the tea ceremony as a potential foretaste of post-historical delights to come. By pulling up the drawbridge to the surrounding world, Japanese culture thrived on ever more elaborate rituals conducted for their own sake. It was this temporary reprieve from history, Kojève declared, that inured Japan to the end of history. For Koestler, however, far from constituting an asset, the relatively insular development of Japanese society hampered cultural creativity. Wherever Koestler cast his glance, he witnessed symptoms of a calcified culture. Instead of formal perfection, Koestler sees stagnation everywhere. Flower arrangements for Koestler were a depressing sight, usually surrounded by esoteric claptrap. The famous Ryoanji rock art in Kyoto causes him a sad, heart-sinking sensation. Noh theater, a daintified pastime for aficionados. The national propensity for drawing, only the outward manifestation of a hegemony of groupthink and utterly devoid of any individual expression. To make a long story short, Japan, Koestler found virtually nothing to write home about. In fact, he came back prouder than ever to be a European. The East, it turns out, has no lesson to teach the West. Kojève, on the other hand, almost undergoes a Damascene conversion in Japan. In his final public statement on the country in 1968, he compares the European way of life in general and British manners in particular unfavorably to social interactions in Japan. What in Great Britain remained the preserve of the aristocracy, in Japan became an unprecedented experiment in democratic snobbery. Now, I'm running out of time, but I'd like to shed light on a third aspect of Kojève's relationship to Japan. We got to know the tourist, and we got to know the contrarian interpreter of Japanese culture. Kojève also went to Japan as a traveling salesman in an official function. It has been a recent trend in Kojève scholarship to pay heed to his later administrative and diplomatic career. I would add that this trend is not restricted to Kojève as an individual, but applies more generally to intellectuals in international institutions. It's almost as if a whole new subdiscipline in intellectual history is emerging. When Kojève announces that international bureaucracy and the primacy of trade have replaced the nation-state politics of old, commentators often miss the punchline. By becoming a bureaucrat himself, Kojève entered one of the few rewarding occupations that are left at the end of history. Kojève rejoiced in his administrative turn, professing, "I love this job," in his last interview in 1968. He much preferred his administrative work to the stale exercises of academic philosophy. As Kojève made clear, bureaucracy, as he understood it, was, I quote, "a higher form of play." If politicians adjudicated matters of life and peace, the bureaucrats of the post-histoire steered international trade and the global economy. Now, throughout the 1950s, 1960s, Japan was one of the fastest growing economies in the developed world, which greatly worried French policymakers. Commodities made in Japan, often cheaper to produce and of at least the same, if not better quality than French goods, were entering the world market at an impressive pace. For many in a protectionist France, this was a form of social dumping which aroused suspicions. A peculiar combination of fear and disdain characterized contemporary French reactions to Japan's rise as an economic powerhouse. Always prone to a complex of superiority, Charles de Gaulle neatly encapsulated this mood when in 1962, he haughtily referred to Japanese Prime Minister Ikeda as a transistor salesman during a state visit in Japan. As a trade specialist, Kojève felt compelled to counter what the French government increasingly perceived as a threat. In fact, Paris had long since promised the government in Tokyo to grant Japanese products greater access to the French market. But time and again, France used special provisions of the GATT treaties as a pretext for implementing import restrictions. Tokyo increasingly lost its patience and no longer accepted this form of economic discrimination, pushing instead for extensive trade liberalization. Finally, the International Monetary Fund stepped in and reminded the French government of its international obligations. Now, more often than not, Kojève traveled to Japan, and this is my final statement, Kojève traveled to Japan to diffuse these trade tensions. He also devised wildly ambitious schemes to defang Japan's tiger economy. One proposal centered on a regional bloc of Asian economies spearheaded by Japan, which would deflect the pressure to absorb Japanese goods onto its regional neighbors, in the same way European integration opened up markets for German exports. Another was to include Japan in the British-led Commonwealth, which would leave the Anglophone countries to deal with the incoming flood of hyper-competitive Japanese products. So international trade disputes thus formed the third pillar of Kojève's relationship to Japan. Perhaps I'll leave it at that, but I hope to have shown that moving beyond the famous footnote on Japan can provide new insights. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Danilo. That was fascinating. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to unshare your screen or if you could possibly unshare it.
Yeah, I'll try that. Is it ended yet? No.
No, it hasn't. But okay, yes. Hang on one second.
It's over now, right? Do you see my screen still?
I think I still see your screen.
Yeah,
wait.
I think we're still seeing it.
It's okay. I'm just trying to see if there's something that there we go. Thank you, Danilo. Yeah. Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so I have my own questions, but I'm going to pocket those to allow others to speak if they'd like to. I have two questions already. But if you do have a question, just a reminder, you're welcome to use the raise your hand function, and I'll try to put you in the queue. So my first question, Hagar Waslati has asked me to read aloud a question for Igor. So I think we'll start with that. So Igor, Hagar asks, before the leap into the universal homogeneous state, what is to be done with slaves without masters and masters without slaves? How does Kojève treat this important chapter on the glorious path of the universal homogeneous state? So Igor, I'll let you respond to that.
I'll try to be brief. I mean, it's a complicated question, and I think can be interpreted. The answer can be interpreted in various respects. I'll give a few. One was the one that Boris Groisman suggested, that what ends up happening, at least maybe not before or the accelerationary phase, but after, is the philosopher becomes the slave, which is, very idiosyncratic as well, and everyone else is the master. So that's one possibility. Another possibility that resonates, I think, with what Teresa was proposing is the role of law, right, as an institutional force that actually makes that possible for all of us to become effectively masters, and a situation where we're not ruled, right? And I think the real answer to that can be found at the kind of intersection of the notion of authority and the outline to the phenomenology of right. So that's another. A third possibility, which I'm more favorable to, is the, let's call it the proto-Nietzschean possibility. The way I read this Kojèvian moment, right, is sort of a celebration of the last man. Whereas Nietzsche, it's like horror. This is the worst possible thing that could happen to Western, European, I should say, civilization. This is something that Kojève embraces, in fact. And I think if you think about it from this Nietzschean lens, if Nietzsche was trying to invert the Hegelian phenomenology of spirit, where the slave, bondsman gets the upper hand, Nietzsche wanted it to be inverted again. So the master gets the upper hand. But what Kojève does is yet another reversal, where in fact we all become masters effectively, right? And this is possible because mutual omnilateral recognition can be realized in and through the legal form, which also simultaneously makes it possible to do away with the political, which was so crucial to him in responding to Schmidt. So I think the answer to your question has to be somewhere in the middle, or interstices of this kind of typology, because if we take seriously his attempt to sketch out, right, this universal homogeneous state, and think about where we could situate him, right, vis-a-vis Hegel, vis-a-vis Marx, but also Nietzsche, it's possible to become right what Nietzsche thought was impossible, right? You cannot have mastery or master morality without the slaves. So you cannot have, in other words, an Übermensch without some kind of category class of Untermensch. And that's really important, I think, to acknowledge. But Kojève wants to say that, yes, in fact, it's possible for all of us to be masters without being Untermensch. You see, but that's kind of an open-ended interpretation. But I think it needs to be taken seriously that he was also responding to Nietzsche. And whereas for Nietzsche, the last man is horror, for Kojève, it seems to be, kind of the post-historical individual.
Thank you, Igor, for that answer. So I have next Isabel, who has two questions, but after her is Teresa. So Isabel, I'm going to let you ask the first question, and then maybe we'll circle around if there aren't any other ones. So Isabel, please, and then Teresa.
Yeah, I will try to. I actually had questions for everyone, but then I'm just focusing on a small commentary and question to Danilo. Thank you for this exciting talk. It was really fantastic also to see this visual material. And I had about Köstler, I found this really exciting to bring him together with Kojève, and I had to think about his book review of Herrigel and the Zen and the Art of Alchemy as like a third quite interesting context, also 1960, 1961, and both Köstler and Gershom Scholem, as two Jewish writers, wrote quite critical reviews of this book, and also about its ideological background. So this relation between Japanese Zen and the Nazi state or Nazi ideology. And my question would be, might Kojève be aware of all this political loading of the reception of Zen in the West as well in the 60s? And secondly, how was his own relation to Zen Buddhism, and how important is in terms of aesthetics, but also as a philosophical current for his work? What do you think about that?
I think if I'm not entirely mistaken, there is also the copy of the Herr-Igel book in Kojève's philosophical library. I know for your question whether he was aware of all the political implications and sort of like the Heideggerian Nazi slant on this reception of Zen thought, I'd be less certain, because I think what Kojève noticed about Köstler was above all that he was a rabid anti-communist, and I think that's what was sort of what I guess predetermined a certain oppositional stance. Kojève himself, obviously, in his student days, was very interested in Buddhist thought. I mean, and we have, I think, in the diary, there's a sort of imaginary dialogue between Buddha and Descartes. I think he read Sanskrit, Tibetan, Chinese. He was part of a sort of group of Oriental scholars at Heidelberg. So all of this was deeply important to him. But he also said in this 1968 interview, which I quoted, that interest in Buddhism, j'ai fait fausse route. J'ai fait fausse route in French, which basically took a wrong direction. This isn't really what I thought would lead me towards the sort of breakthrough that later represented the idea of the end of history. But there's definitely sort of an early interest in the concept of nothingness, for instance, and that he sort of lifts out of his Buddhist texts. And I've also got, if you're interested, I've got a sort of there's not that many, but there are like 4 or 5 books from the 1920s and 30s on Buddhism, mainly German, that I also found in Kojève's library. But I didn't want to, because there was obviously now a temptation to just sort of like push that into presentation as well. So as is Japan and Buddhism, it's all the same. But I think for me, the crucial difference is that, I mean, he didn't speak Japanese and didn't read Japanese. And that's, even though Buddhism has obviously sort of occurs in Japan, but its place of origin is a different one. So I didn't focus as much on the sort of 1920s, 1930s, but more like 1920s interest in Buddhism. But that was very strong. It was a very important factor in Kojève's thinking.
Thank you, Danilo. So the lines now, Teresa, Andres Nigel would also like to say something, and then I have Luis after that. So Teresa, please go ahead.
Thank you to the 3 of you for 3 very interesting presentations. I also have a question for Danilo. One, given the fact that you say, and I think you're right, that Kojève was there also on a diplomatic mission on this question of the trade agreements. Do you have any element to say what was... un attimo, Carolina, scusa, un secondo. Do you have any element to say what was Kojève's political vision on the place that Japan should occupy in the New World Order? First question. Second question. So I said that, for example, in the Düsseldorf conference, Kojève says that we should provincialize Europe. And I think it's very interesting, the comparison you make with this Köstler. So if we would say that for Kojève, Japan is the future of Europe, or Europe should be provincialized in favor of the Japanese way of the end of history. What does this say of his vision of Europe, both as a philosophical question and as a political one? Thank you.
For your first question, Japan's place in the world, I mean, there was he sort of saw it in strict analogy to the role of Germany, and I think it's very interesting when you compare. So I've recently just finished a sort of small article on Alexandre Koyré at Kojève, and Koyré, having lived in exile in New York, I mean, basically published just hardcore essays in 1945, much stronger than the Morgenthau-Plan, saying Germany must never be allowed to sort of get on its feet. If there's a couple of million starving because they're undernourished, so be it, because they've brought such suffering over the world. That was not at all Kojève's view. Kojève very early came around to the fact that what you want to make impossible is Germany rearming, right? So you need to disable the armaments industry. And by the price to be paid for that is that there's no way you can avoid Germany becoming the economic hegemonic power in Europe. But what they won't notice, because they're not very smart politically, Kojève's reasoning went was, but basically that France is pulling the levers at the European economic community, which is very much what happened. If you look at the archives, that like even though Germany's economy was very dynamic in the 60s, I mean, it was very rare for them to get their points across and get their points implemented in the EC. That only changed a little later, and Quinn Slobodin has written a very good book about that. So that was really some excellent reckoning. And the point was also, what is Japan's place in the world, where it's obviously, there's two options for Kojève. Like either I found a couple of administrative notes where it's like either Japan or China in the end of the world. And so it depends on basically, but at this stage, he was so charted with what he saw in the Soviet Union. He told you in 1957 when he, it's when this idea came about that this is basically just an impoverished America, that they wouldn't have a sort of strength to pull along the Asian neighboring countries. And for him, it was quite clear that sort of Japan would be a regional economy, and it's all about making that palatable to its neighboring countries, which means you have to insist on the pacifist constitution, which Japan has upheld to this day. So no more army, and so then they peacefully can acquiesce into Japanese economic superiority. Your second point about sort of provincializing Europe, I mean, the thing is, that's a vast question. And what sort of this openness for Japan, as opposed to like Köstler's navel gazing, what that means for us, for a deep provincialized vision of Europe, I would still say that, I mean, I have a very jaded view of like, I mean, that's a chapter in the book as well, but I mean, Kojève was not an anti-colonial thinker, and we can sort of spin it all the way we want. I mean, he was really, he was asked to sign basically the Manifest of 121, which protested against the torture by Algerian insurgents by the French army, and he refused to sign it. And it was by Denis Mascolo, one of the attendees.
Sorry, just on this, but he was also a French civil servant. I think he would have lost his job. He would have, if he would have. I mean, this is not an excuse, right? I mean, one could have done. No,
you're right. This is your point is fair and excellent, because this is the pretext he put then in his when he in a note explaining why he couldn't sign this. But there is also an idea that I mean, in the introduction to reading of Hegel, he does make fun of these independence movements. I mean, we should not turn Kojève into an anti-colonialist avant la lettre. This idea that like Papua New Guinea, Togo, that they become independent, for him that was just laughable, because as you said in your own talk, it's all about creating viable economic blocks. So this idea of like political fighting for political independence, that was already anachronistic for him at the same time. And but he was definitely more open. I mean, the other thing we could, I don't want to take, we could also talk about his role in the UNCTAD, the United Nations Trade and Development Scheme, because there he really did fight like a lion on behalf of developing countries so that they could have preferential access to export markets. Because, the West and Europe in particular, we're still doing that to this day. We're blocking our markets against cheap imports, agricultural imports from Africa. And for Kojève, that was a complete disgrace and a shame. And he really strove all his administrative life to end this state of affairs. So like a fighter against economic colonialism, yes, but he just thought political independence movements were a thing of the past. I'll leave it there maybe.
Thank you. So next, Andres Nigel, who I just gave access to video and audio. So please, Andres.
Hi. Sorry, it always takes a second. Also from my side, thank you very much, all three of you. And I also want to say thanks to the organizers. Already been a great experience so far. I'm looking forward to the other 2 days. And I thought, because in a way, this is a more open question, but also for me, Danilo's talk really triggered this again, because it's sort of related to the question I wanted to ask in the keynote before, because I was exactly thinking also about this passage from Fukuyama, but more in the sense, and moving away from your very kind of precise historical analysis or kind of fact-based analysis to a slightly more philosophical question, because I felt like in Bo Scholz's text lecture, he was focusing on this kind of ideal notion of the post-historical state, or also the notion of post-truth, and then this kind of seemingly more concrete example of Japan kind of opens for me a lot of questions. How do you bring together this kind of idealized version of post-truth society and this this specific example, which as you pointed out, Kojève seemed to have been convinced by, and specifically regarding these two kind of consequences, or supposed consequences of the end of history, which is the end of art with content and in favor of the empty play of form, and then in Bo Scholz's talk, the end of philosophy in favor of the sage, as he put it. But I'm to my question. Sorry for for me it seems like a question for me. How do you or would you say it requires a certain amount of maybe projection to kind of define this Japanese art as kind of an empty play, as he does, an empty play of form, in order to substantiate this thesis. So there's what I feel like there is kind of in using this concrete example, there seems to be this philosophical inversion where there is sort of suddenly the idea that there is such a thing as this empty form, and then he's looking at as Japan, or this empty play of form in art, and he's looking at Japan as an example. It's just something I'm curious about.
I mean, that was more a comment than a question, wasn't it? I mean, as well, that because the one aspect of your comment pertains to the history of art, and I think there with sort of like with post-historical art, this is actually one of a few terrains where Kojève is on very safe Hegelian grounds, because I mean in Hegel's aesthetic, obviously that I mean the history of art had come to an end. That was one thing where like both actually agree, and then as for the other sort of appreciation, or let's just say Kojève's overall appraisal of the history of art and where the Japanese art comes into it. I don't know whether you had time to, that was also, I saw it yesterday when you watched the documentary, and there's a sort of, towards the end, I think a dialogue between Nina Kuznetsov, and I'm very glad that she's joined us today. She sort of accompanied my research for a very long time, and I think Marco Filoni, where basically because then Kojève is not into postmodern art or architecture. Yeah, so there's also, I mean, there we talk about he's really into sort of Gothic painting and architecture, and not at all into romanticism. Obviously, there's a few, I think, Kandinsky's it were in his apartment, but he didn't have this. I mean. I'm not sure what he would have made of the sort of nouveau roman, for instance. I mean, the literature appropriate for the end of history he reviewed and was François Sagan, and where basically ironic playfulness. Yeah, that's definitely that would be the hallmark of that. But to what extent then that kind of ties in with Japanese art, because what he says, of course, these are historical cultural practices in Japan that have survived and have been refined, right? Rather than so they didn't need this break with the past, which he kind of perhaps thought as more characteristic for Western art.
Thank you.
And I would,
I maybe because you didn't understand the question, but sorry. No, thank you very much. I just because there was a question and I didn't explicitly say it. It's just about the question about the identification of the state of the end of history through a certain kind of art. Like I don't know how to say it. Like how does Kojève identify in a concrete sense that something is of or has elements of the end of history or the post-historical world.
And you're referring to that specifically, Andreas, in the context of Japan.
Yeah, because there I presume that he's using this as an example. Kojève.
Danilo, I don't know if you want to add anything. We have.
Yeah. I mean,
yeah,
that's what basically. I mean, I think that the main criterion he singles out in the footnotes, obviously, the detachment of form of content. So and they are separate henceforth, and that can translate. So that means one thing that you sort of do. That the elaborate ritualistic displays of that, you do them for the sake of their complexity and for their intractability rather than for attaining an end. You also don't do it to a sort of obtain, basically you create artificial negativity. Yeah, that's something, and I think if you want to sort of, again, bit of context, you would not have written that footnote without sort of dialogues with Georges Bataille about what he calls négativité sans emploi, unemployed negativity. Yeah, so this idea like, Bataille was always like, your end of history doesn't make sense to me because even if there's no objective historical resistance to human self-actualization, individual human beings will always create these difficulties for themselves. And there's different way of doing that. I mean, either by just sort of like munching a few burgers or by just creating sort of a certain aesthetic artifacts. And I think this is definitely one way for Kojève of incorporating that. Now, I don't know if you want now a catalog of criteria, how we do it. I mean, in the social realm, in social conversations, there's definitely something to do with a certain form of manners, yeah, a certain form of flirtation, a certain form. I mean, this is quite clearly he himself describes also, and that's something that is no longer. I mean, he wouldn't be a fan of Harry or Meghan Markle. He located that more precisely in the upper echelons of international diplomacy. Yeah, in this 1968 he also said that basically the aristocracy of today is sort of suited kind of salesmen on the international summits, and that he admires their brain power. And I mean, to put it provocatively, I think he would be a pretty big fan of Mario Draghi today. And I think this is something also where basically the sort of, yes, I mean, I'm working on another book on the sort of emancipatory conception of bureaucracy and technocracy, and Kojève is definitely one of the few figures who kind of espoused the positive vision of it. And he thought this is where it's at, and basically the academic pulpits, us academics, this is the boring, nonsensical stuff, yeah, and the few things where you kind of can act out these sort of, yeah, sure, it's no longer about anything, it's just economics, boring trade, but you still want to win against other countries. It's just no longer a matter of war and peace.
So in the interest of time, we have, I'm trying to get us out of here by the end of the hour, whatever that hour is to you. So I see right now, I believe, Luis, you had a question. Your hand was up, and then Kyle has a question. So perhaps those can be our final two questions. Luis, if you want to ask your question.
Yes, I would like to ask my question, and I would like to address it to Cristiano Vidali, whose talk I found very interesting, as well as the others. And my question relates to the fact that, I mean, if I have understood well, Cristiano says that Kojève's notion of history implies not so much the suppression of the thing as such, but of a meaningful thing, to the extent that this thing incorporates tradition, a previous eliminated past that bears a sense. Now, if that interpretation is right, how is that suppression of meaningful things compatible with Kojève's concern about linking desire with the real, to the point that he evokes a sentence of men Devirant to define the real as, he says, the real is that which resists. So apparently, from this point of view, Kojève needs the real, needs the object, needs the thing as such in order to be suppressed by desire and transform into the concept. And from this standpoint, it seems rather that what the concept does is to accumulate meaning. But in order to accumulate meaning, the concept needs the real, the thing as such. And that is why, perhaps, in his outline of a phenomenology of right, he makes this distinction between the thing as a finished product and the thing as a concept project. It appears to me that if you understand the thing as a meaningful thing that has to be suppressed, his history as such would end up explaining itself by itself, losing every connection with reality and with the object. So that is more or less the question, reflection that I address to Cristiano Vidali. Thanks.
I understand it might seem that my interpretation of Kojève might appear as a too hermeneutic interpretation of Kojève, as if tradition always filtered our relationship with reality, which is something which naturally there are several passages where Kojève makes statements that are against this idea, because when he talks of the dog, I changed the idea across time, but we must have a concrete and natural reference in order for a concept to be inheritable as well. And this is naturally something that can be rejected, and this is so to say what I would say the materialistic side of Kojève, and which in my book I emphasize by talking of needs, of natural needs. If I am born independently of which moment of history, if I am born in a determined historical moment, I have some needs, natural needs, that are satisfied less or more according to the level of progress, so to say, where progress can be told as such if related to natural needs. If there are no natural needs, we cannot talk about progress in any sense. But if this is something which is very poor in the description, because it could be related only to very simple, to very elementary relationship. If we talk about a smartphone, in which sense it relates to our needs and satisfies our needs. It satisfies some needs that are historically born, but I do have those needs and I do satisfy them with the use of a smartphone if I inherit that specific tradition that tells me that I have to interact with people who live on the other side of the planet. And therefore, if I don't have a smartphone, I feel as if I had something missing. Okay, and that is the same in terms of the concept and reality. If there are concepts that are adequate or not to reality, I must be born within a specific tradition that has inherited those concepts that struggle to adhere to reality, and within a given framework of possibilities of interpretations are forced or right or correct or adherent to reality or not. So this is very important to me, because otherwise, so to say, Kojève would be an ingenuous realist. So it would be that any concept would be valuable at any time in any other world. But in my opinion, if he's a witty reader of Hegel, as he of course he is, the historical component of this must be introduced. Indeed, it is the specific sense of historicity of the concept in my reading of him.